Rain slicks the pavement outside the majestic theater, and Thomas steps deliberately between the rushing traffic and Eleanor, taking the cab's splash of dirty water onto his own trousers without a word. Her dress stays perfect. He simply opens her door. These were not suggestions in 1954. They were ironclad rules every young man was expected to know, follow, and never once explain. Before the war, courtship happened inside a woman's home. A suitor called at the parlor door, sat under the watchful eye of a chaperone, and the woman's family controlled every moment of the encounter. Then the soldiers came home, prosperity arrived, and the automobile changed everything. By the late 1940s, romance had moved from the private parlor to the public sphere, to diners, drive-ins, and movie theaters, and the man, as driver and host, had taken the lead in a way that would have been unthinkable a generation before. The urgency behind these courtship rules was real and measurable. By 1956, the median age of first marriage for American women had dropped to a record low of 20.1 years. For men, it was 22.5. These were not grown adults with years to experiment. They were young people operating under genuine social and family pressure. In a world where a misstep on a date could close a door that might not open again. The rules existed because the stakes were that high, and everyone in the room understood it. Here is what makes these rules so fascinating. Not one of them was written down in any official place. There was no handbook handed out at high school graduation, no government pamphlet tucked into a young man's jacket pocket. These expectations were absorbed through watching older brothers, observing fathers, reading between the lines of magazine columns, and feeling the silent disapproval of a girl's mother when something went wrong. The code was unspoken precisely because it was assumed, and every young man who wanted to be taken seriously knew it by heart. Every date had 5 distinct phases, and each one carried its own set of expectations. We are going to walk through all of them together, starting at the very beginning, before he had even put on his jacket or checked his hair in the mirror. Phase 1 was the invitation itself, and the way a man asked was already being judged before she had given her answer. The manner of asking told her, and her family, almost everything they needed to know about who he was. Rule 1 was about timing, and the timing was specific. If you wanted to take a girl out on Saturday, you asked her by Wednesday. Not Thursday, not Friday afternoon in the hallway between classes. Wednesday. This was not an arbitrary deadline. It was a signal. A Wednesday invitation said that you had been thinking about her, that you had planned ahead, and that you respected her enough to give her time. A Friday ask, by contrast, said she was a last resort, and she knew it, and so did everyone around her. The Wednesday rule served a practical purpose that modern life has almost entirely erased. A girl in 1954 needed time. She needed to decide which dress to wear, whether it needed pressing, whether her hair required a set the night before. She might need to visit the beauty parlor on Friday morning. She needed to tell her mother, who would want to know where they were going and what time she would be home. 3 days was not excessive. It was the minimum courtesy that acknowledged her preparation was as real and as demanding as his invitation. When the Wednesday rule disappeared, something quiet went with it. The anticipation of a Saturday date used to begin on Wednesday evening and build for 3 full days. She had something to look forward to, something to prepare for, something that made the week feel like it was moving toward a moment. When invitations began arriving the same afternoon as the date, or worse, as a text message while she was already getting ready for something else, the occasion itself collapsed. Saturday became just another evening rather than an event she had been moving toward all week. Rule 2 was about the method of asking, and it had no exceptions. A young man asked in person or by calling the family's home telephone. He did not pass a note through a mutual friend. He did not ask her best friend to ask her. He did not write it in a letter and hope for the best. The direct ask, whether face-to-face or by telephone, required him to put himself in a position of genuine vulnerability, to hear her answer, whatever it was, in real time, and that willingness to be vulnerable was itself part of the signal he was sending. The family landline call had its own particular ritual, and every young man who had ever dialed a girl's number knew exactly what it felt like. The phone would ring in her house. Her father might answer, or her mother. There would be a pause while she was called to the phone, and in that pause, the young man was already being evaluated. By the steadiness of his voice when he said good evening, by whether he identified himself clearly, by whether he asked after the family before getting to his purpose. Her parents were not obstacles. They were the first audience, and he knew it. What was lost when the direct ask disappeared is harder to name than it sounds. It was not just politeness, it was the proof of intention. A young man who called the family landline and asked her father for a moment of his daughter's time had already demonstrated something, that he was willing to be seen, to be accountable, to stand behind his interest in her with his own voice and his own name. When that requirement dissolved, the cost of asking dropped to nearly nothing, and with it went the signal that asking had always carried. Effort was the message. When effort became optional, so did the message. Rule 3 sounds almost comically simple until you sit with it. A man was expected to arrive with a specific plan. Not, "I thought we might do something." Not, "What are you in the mood for?" A specific plan, a theater, a restaurant, a drive to a particular place he had chosen with her in mind. The vague invitation was considered a form of laziness that transferred the burden of decision onto her, which was precisely the opposite of what a date was supposed to do. He was the host. Hosts do not ask their guests to plan the evening. The requirement to have a plan was really a requirement to have thought about her before she arrived. Choosing a specific restaurant meant he had considered whether she might enjoy it. Choosing a film meant he had thought about what she might find interesting or beautiful. The plan was evidence of prior attention, and prior attention was the earliest form of courtship. When a man showed up with a plan, he was saying, "I have been thinking about you since Wednesday." That sentence, unspoken, was the whole point. What was lost when the specific plan became optional is something women of a certain age describe with a particular kind of wistfulness. It was the feeling of being deliberately chosen for a specific evening, not chosen as a companion for whatever happened to come up, but chosen for this restaurant, this film, this particular Saturday night that he had constructed with her in mind. The modern equivalent, "I don't know, you pick," is not neutral. It communicates something too, and what it communicates is the opposite of what a 1950s invitation was designed to say. Rule 4 was a social boundary with real teeth. You did not ask a girl who was already pinned. Being pinned meant she was in an exclusive relationship, and in the social architecture of the 1950s, that status was not merely understood, it was displayed. A pinned girl wore visible, tangible proof of her commitment, and approaching her with a romantic invitation anyway was not just rude. It was a violation of a code that the entire community enforced, and the young man who broke it would feel the consequences from her friends, her family, and his own. The going steady economy was surprisingly tangible. When a young man asked a girl to go steady, he gave her something physical to wear as a declaration. His class ring, often wrapped carefully in pale Angora yarn to fit her smaller finger. His Letterman sweater, which she would wear to school like a billboard of their commitment. Or a promise ring, purchased at a jewelry counter for a few dollars, but carrying a weight far beyond its price. These objects were not decorative. They were social contracts worn on the body, visible to everyone in every hallway and at every soda fountain in town. What was lost when these visible tokens disappeared is something that sounds almost too simple to mourn: clarity. In the 1950s, you could look at a girl's hand or her sweater and know, without asking, whether she was available. The ambiguity that defines so much of modern romantic life, are we exclusive? What are we? Where is this going? Did not exist in the same way when the answer was literally pinned to her cardigan. The tokens were not just sweet. They were a shared language that removed an enormous amount of anxiety from the social landscape. Rule 5 closed out the invitation phase with a standard that admitted no exceptions. A man dressed to the standard of the venue. Polished shoes were the floor, not the ceiling. For a dinner out, that meant a suit jacket and a tie, pressed trousers, and shoes that had been buffed before he left the house. For a movie, a sport coat at minimum. The logic was simple and unforgiving. She had spent hours preparing herself for the evening. His appearance was the first signal of whether he understood that her effort deserved a response in kind. Phase 2 of a 1950s date began the moment he turned onto her street, and it had its own complete theater of expectation. The arrival was not a logistical moment. It was a performance, and the audience was her entire household. Her mother was watching from the kitchen window. Her father was in the living room with one ear toward the front door. Her younger siblings might be peering through the curtains. Every choice he made in the next 4 minutes would be discussed at the dinner table for days, and he knew it, even if no one ever said so directly. Rule 6 was about punctuality, and in the 1950s, punctuality carried a moral weight that scheduling apps have completely erased. Arriving exactly on time meant he respected her household's rhythm and her family's evening. Arriving early was considered almost as bad as arriving late. It signaled eagerness that bordered on desperation, and it disrupted her preparation at the worst possible moment. Arriving late was simply disrespectful, a signal that his time mattered more than hers. And in a household where her father was waiting to shake his hand, lateness was noticed and remembered. Punctuality in the 1950s was not a preference or a personality quirk. It was a moral statement. When a young man arrived at precisely the agreed-upon hour, he was communicating something to the entire household. That he took this family seriously, that he understood their daughter's time had value, and that he was the kind of man who could be trusted with something precious. Showing up even 10 minutes late without a telephone call was considered a character flaw, not a scheduling mishap. Rule 7 sounds almost comically simple until you understand what it replaced. Walking to the front door and ringing the bell was the formal opening act of the entire evening. It required him to leave his car, cross the yard, and present himself to the household. He was not merely picking up a passenger. He was entering into a brief, visible relationship with her family, announcing himself and accepting whatever scrutiny came with that announcement. The driveway honk, by contrast, treated her like a parcel to be collected. The honk versus bell divide was not a minor stylistic difference. It cut right to the question of how a man regarded the woman he was courting. Ringing the bell said, "I see you as a person with a family, a home, and a threshold worth crossing with respect." Honking from the driveway said, "I see you as someone who should come to me." Young women of the era understood this distinction intuitively, and so did their mothers, who would note which kind of suitor their daughter had attracted and form opinions accordingly. What we lost when the bell-ringing ritual faded was something harder to name than mere politeness. It was the ceremony of the threshold. The front door was the boundary between her private world and the public evening ahead, and the act of crossing it together, with her family's knowledge and blessing, gave the date a kind of consecration. It had a beginning with weight to it. Today, a text message that reads, "Here," does the same logistical work, but it carries none of that weight. The evening simply starts with no ceremony at all. Rule 8 was the one that separated the boys from the men in the most direct way possible. Shaking the father's hand and accepting his questions without irritation or deflection was a test every young man knew was coming, and the way he handled it told the father almost everything he needed to know. A firm handshake, direct eye contact, a steady voice when answering, "Where are you going and what time will she be home?" These were not obstacles. They were the price of admission, and a young man who understood that paid it gracefully. The father's questions were a ritual interrogation with a very specific purpose. "Where are you going tonight? What time will she be home? What does your father do?" These were not small talk. They were the father assembling a picture of this young man's judgment, his family, his plans. A young man who named a specific restaurant, a specific film, a specific return time, and answered without hedging, was demonstrating the same quality the Wednesday invitation rule demanded, that he had thought ahead, that he had a plan, and that he took the responsibilities seriously. What we lost when this accountability structure disappeared was the weight of the family's trust as a living, present thing. A young man who had looked her father in the eye and named a curfew carried that promise with him for the entire evening. It was not abstract. It was a commitment made to a specific man in a specific room, and breaking it had real social consequences in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. The accountability was triangular, between him, her, and her family. Remove the family from the triangle, and the whole structure changes shape. Rule 9 is one that often gets overlooked in favor of the more dramatic gestures, but the women who lived through this era remembered it clearly. Complimenting the mother was not flattery, and it was not theater. It was a sincere acknowledgement of the household she had built and the daughter she had raised. A well-placed remark about the flowers in the hallway or the warmth of the home took 30 seconds and cost nothing, but it told the mother that this young man noticed the care that had gone into the world her daughter came from. Mothers remembered who did it and who did not. Rule 10, the corsage, was its own entire language. For formal events like a school dance or a dinner out, a young man was expected to bring a small floral arrangement for her wrist or lapel, and the choice of flower was not random. Gardenias suggested elegance and admiration. Carnations were cheerful and affordable. Orchids signaled that he had spent real money and meant it. Getting the color right mattered too, because it needed to complement her dress, which meant he had either asked or paid close enough attention to know. The corsage was a small, perishable proof of forethought. Rule 11, helping her with her coat before leaving the house, was the first physical act of care in the entire evening, and it happened before they had even stepped outside together. He would hold the coat open and steady while she slipped her arms in, then settle it gently onto her shoulders. It sounds like nothing, but in the context of an evening that was just beginning, it was a quiet declaration of intent. I will be attending to your comfort tonight. Every small gesture that followed was built on the foundation of that first one. Once the front door closed behind them, the date moved into its second theater: the sidewalk, the car, and the journey to wherever the evening was headed. This phase had its own strict choreography, and it was entirely visible to anyone on the street. Neighbors watched. Other couples noticed. The way a young man navigated the space between the front door and the passenger seat of his car communicated his upbringing, his character, and his intentions as clearly as anything he might say over dinner. The transit was not neutral. It was a performance with an audience. Rule 12, the curb walk, is the one that stopped Thomas from letting Eleanor get splashed outside the majestic theater. The rule was absolute. A man always walked on the street side of the sidewalk, placing his body between his companion and the traffic. It was so deeply ingrained that most men of that generation did it automatically, without thinking, the way you might hold a door. If they switched direction on a corner, they would quietly step around her so the correct positioning was maintained. It was a reflex built by years of social conditioning. The curb walk had its roots in the Victorian era, when the genuine hazard was a horse-drawn carriage losing control or a passing cart splashing mud from an unpaved street. By the 1950s, horses were long gone, but the rule had updated itself naturally for automobiles, which threw up rooster tails of dirty water from rain-soaked gutters and occasionally mounted curbs entirely. The gesture was also a holdover from an older idea, that a man's body was a resource to be placed between his companion and whatever the world might throw at them. The hazard changed. The principle did not. What we lost when the curb walk disappeared is something that is genuinely difficult to articulate to someone who has never experienced it. It was the physical embodiment of a man placing himself between his partner and the hazards of the world.
Not symbolically, literally.
His body was the buffer, There was something in that quiet, unremarked positioning that said, "While you are with me, I am paying attention to what could harm you, and I have already moved to prevent it. You do not need to think about the traffic. I have already thought about it for you." Rule 13 extended the logic of the curb walk directly to the car. He opened her door, waited while she settled herself and arranged her skirt, then closed the door securely before walking around to the driver's side. She never touched her own door handle from the outside. This was not because she was incapable of opening a car door. It was because the act of opening it for her was a statement. Your comfort and your arrival are my responsibility tonight. The sequence was always the same. Her door first, her settled, her door closed, then him. The 1954 Chevrolet Bel Air was not just a car in the context of 1950s courtship. It was a stage, and the car door ritual was one of its most public scenes. Neighbors on their porches could see it. Other couples driving past could see it. The whole neighborhood understood the grammar of what they were watching. A young man who opened the door and waited communicated one thing. A young man who climbed in and reached across to unlock it from the inside communicated something else entirely. The car made private behavior visible, and visible behavior had social consequences. What we lost when this ritual faded was something deceptively small: the pause. The moment between her door closing and him walking around to his side was a tiny interval of pure ceremony. It had no practical function. He was not checking anything or adjusting anything. He was simply completing the act before beginning the next one. That pause was proof that her comfort came before his convenience, even in something as minor as the sequence of getting into a car. When the pause disappeared, something about the texture of being cared for disappeared with it. Rule 14 was subtler than the curb walk or the car door, but the women who experienced it remember it with particular warmth. Offering an arm on uneven ground on stairs or stepping down from a curb was not a possessive gesture. It was an attentive one. It said, "I noticed that the ground is unsteady here, and I am offering you something solid before you need to ask for it." The key word is before. He anticipated the need and acted on it quietly, without drawing attention to the fact that he had noticed at all. That quality of quiet attentiveness is what made it feel like genuine care. Rule 15. Driving responsibly with a lady in the car was a rule that carried a specific edge in the 1950s because hot rodding was genuinely fashionable among young men of the era. The same boy who burned rubber at a stoplight with his friends on a Friday afternoon was expected to drive with complete steadiness and care when a date was in the passenger seat. The contrast was not hypocrisy. It was the point. It demonstrated that he could distinguish between the contexts that called for restraint and those that did not, which is exactly the quality a woman's family wanted to know he possessed. The restraint behind the wheel was a character signal in a way that is hard to translate into modern terms. Speed and power were available to him. He chose not to use them. That voluntary restraint, exercised in a context where showing off would have been easy and socially rewarded among his peers, told his date something important, that when he was with her, she was the priority, not his ego. It was the same principle as the curb walk and the car door, expressed through the accelerator pedal. He had the capacity for recklessness and chose steadiness instead. That choice was the point. The restaurant door swings open and the real theater begins. Everything that happened on the sidewalk and in the car was prologue. Inside the venue, a young man in 1950s America faced a completely separate and equally demanding layer of unwritten rules, each one as precise and expected as the last. The dining room, the movie house, the soda fountain counter, each had its own choreography, and a man who knew the steps communicated something wordless but unmistakable. I have been raised to treat this evening as a serious occasion. Here is something worth pausing on. A full Saturday night out in 1955 was genuinely affordable, but it still represented a real financial commitment for a young man earning a modest wage. 2 movie tickets at a neighborhood theater cost roughly $1 total, about 50 cents each. A sit-down dinner for two at a respectable diner or modest restaurant ran somewhere between $3 and $5. Add a corsage, a bus fare, or a soda afterward, and a young man might spend $7 or $8 on a single evening, a meaningful sum when entry-level wages hovered around $40 to $50 a week. The reason the man paid for everything was not simply tradition or chivalry as a vague feeling. It was structural. In 1950, women in the American workforce earned approximately 59 cents for every dollar earned by men. Many young women of dating age lived at home with their parents and had little to no disposable income of their own. The expectation that the man would cover every expense of the evening was, in that economic reality, less a romantic gesture than a practical necessity dressed up as courtesy. Understanding that context makes the rules feel less like performance and more like a system built around real constraints. The moment they stepped inside a restaurant, Rule 16 came into play immediately. He checked her coat. This was not a small thing. It meant he located the coat check attendant, handled the transaction, received the numbered ticket, and tucked it safely into his own pocket. She walked into the dining room unencumbered, her hands free, her entrance unhurried. She did not have to fumble with a coat or find somewhere to hang it or worry about it at all for the rest of the evening. He had absorbed that small logistical burden before she even thought about it, and that was precisely the point. Rule 17 seems simple until you watch for it in old photographs and realize how rarely it happens today. He pulled out her chair, but it was not just the pulling. He waited. He stood behind the chair, hands on the back, and he did not move toward his own seat until she was fully settled, her posture adjusted, her handbag placed. Only then did he take his place across from her. The sequence mattered. His comfort was secondary to hers, and the physical arrangement of the table made that hierarchy visible to every other diner in the room. Why did the chair pull matter so specifically? Because it was the first act of the man as host inside the venue, and the word host is the key to understanding almost everything that followed. In the pre-war era of parlor courtship, the woman's home was the setting, and her mother was the hostess. The man was a guest on her family's territory, but post-war dating flipped that entirely. He chose the restaurant, he made the reservation if one was needed, he paid the bill. He was now the host, and a host sees to his guests' comfort before his own. The chair was simply where that hosting began. Rule 18 is one that has almost entirely vanished, and when you explain it to people today, they often look genuinely startled. The table stand. Any time a woman arrived at the table or rose to leave it, the man stood up. Not halfway, not a slight lean forward. He rose fully from his chair. And if another woman joined the table, or if a woman he knew stopped to say hello, he stood for her too. This happened every single time without exception for the entire evening. It was not optional, and it was not considered burdensome. It was simply what a man did. The reason the table stand existed goes deeper than formality. It was a physical acknowledgement that her presence was an honor, not a given. When you stand for someone, your body says, "I noticed you arrived. I am not so absorbed in my own comfort that your entrance went unremarked." In a culture where women were often rendered invisible in public professional spaces, the table stand in a social setting was one of the few places where a woman's presence was made ceremonially visible. He rose. The room registered it. She was seen. That mattered in ways that a polite nod across a table simply cannot replicate. What was lost when the table stand disappeared is something that is genuinely difficult to name precisely, which is why I keep coming back to it. The ceremony of presence. The bodily signal that a woman walking toward you is an event worth interrupting yourself for. We have traded that ritual for eye contact and a smile, which is warmer in some ways and flatter in others. The smile says, "I see you." The table stand said, "Your arrival changes the room." There is a difference between those two things, and the women who grew up watching their fathers stand for their mothers understood that difference without being able to articulate it. Rule 19 is the one that tends to generate the most debate when I bring it up, and I want to give it the full context it deserves. When the waiter arrived, the man did not simply order for himself and wait for her to speak. He asked her quietly what she would like. She told him. And then he turned to the waiter and placed both orders himself, relaying her choices as the host of the table. She never had to negotiate with the service staff, never had to repeat herself if the waiter misheard, never had to manage the logistics of the meal at all. He handled all of it. The reason ordering for her was considered hospitality rather than control comes down to that word again. Host. When you are a guest at a dinner party and your host says, "I'll take care of everything, just enjoy yourself," that is not domination. That is the host absorbing the friction of the evening so the guest can be fully present. In 1950s dating culture, the man was expected to manage every transactional element of the date so that she could focus entirely on the conversation, the connection, and the experience of being taken care of. The ordering ritual was the most visible expression of that hosting philosophy. What was lost when this practice disappeared is something that women of a certain generation describe with a specific word, hosted. They say it quietly, like it names something they have been missing without knowing what to call it. Being fully hosted means someone else has absorbed every logistical friction of the evening on your behalf. You did not calculate, negotiate, manage, or transact. You simply arrived and were taken care of. Modern dating, with its Dutch pay arrangements and its "what do you feel like eating" negotiations, is more equal in one sense and more exhausting in another. The hosting was a gift, and when it went, something specific went with it. Rule 20 is where the economics and the etiquette fuse completely. The financial buffer. A man going on a date in 1955 was expected to carry enough cash to cover every possible expense of the evening and then some. Not a credit card, not a check, not a hope that the bill would come in under what he had in his wallet. Cash. Enough to pay for dinner, the movie, the ice cream afterward, the parking, and a tip that would not embarrass him. And the woman never touched the bill. She did not reach for her purse. She did not offer. The transaction was entirely his to manage, and she was entirely shielded from it. Why cash specifically, and why did fumbling payment matter so much? Because in 1950s American courtship culture, a man's ability to smoothly handle the financial logistics of an evening was read as a proxy for his readiness to provide for a family. The date was, in some sense, a rehearsal for the life he was proposing. A man who counted out coins nervously, or who came up short at the register, or who had to ask her to cover the tip had failed a very public test of preparedness. The cash in his wallet was not just money. It was evidence. It said, "I planned for this. I am ready. You are safe with me." What was lost when the financial buffer disappeared is something that women in my audience often name before I do. Clarity. Absolute, unambiguous clarity about who was responsible for what. There was no moment at the end of a 1955 dinner date where two people sat in mild social agony, wondering whether to reach for the check, whether to offer, whether the offer would be accepted or resented, whether splitting meant something about the evening's romantic temperature. None of that existed. The rules were clear, both people knew them, and the end of the meal was simply the end of the meal, not a negotiation. That clarity was a form of kindness. Rule 21 is brief but pointed. A man on a date never commented on the prices listed on the menu. Not a raised eyebrow, not a quiet whistle, not a remark about how much things had gone up. Nothing. Because the moment he drew attention to the cost of the evening, even casually, he had communicated something devastating to his date. That she was a financial burden on his night. That her presence had a price tag he was aware of. Even if money was genuinely tight, the rule was iron. You absorbed the cost without expression, because making her feel like an expense was one of the worst things a man could do at a dinner table. Rule 22 operated on a similar principle from the opposite direction, tipping discreetly. A man who made a production of leaving a generous tip, who fanned out bills on the table or announced the amount, was considered vulgar rather than impressive. The tip was placed quietly, folded under the edge of a plate, or handed directly and briefly to the waiter as they left. Generosity was expected, but display was not. The distinction mattered because it separated a man who was genuinely gracious from a man who was performing graciousness for an audience. One was character, the other was theater, and the difference was visible to anyone paying attention. Rule 23 is one that has become a historical artifact in the most literal sense, because the social landscape it inhabited no longer exists. If she smoked, he lit her cigarette before lighting his own. He produced the lighter or the matches, held the flame steady for her, waited until her cigarette was lit, and only then attended to his own. In the 1950s, when roughly 45% of American adults smoked, this small gesture of precedence happened on dates across the country every single evening. It was a miniature version of the same principle that governed every other rule. Her comfort and her needs came first, always, in every detail. Rule 24 governed the conversation itself, and it is one that I find genuinely wise when I sit with it. A man on a date kept the conversation light. No past romantic partners, no complaints about money or his job, no political arguments, no talk of illness or family conflict, or anything that would drag the evening into the weight of ordinary life. The date was supposed to be a sanctuary, a few hours deliberately separated from the grind and worry of the week. He was responsible for protecting that atmosphere, which meant policing his own impulse to unload, to vent, or to relitigate old grievances in her company. Why was conversational restraint considered a gift rather than a limitation? Because in the daily life of a 1950s young man, there was no shortage of things to worry about. The Korean War had just ended. The economy was shifting. A first job, a shared apartment, a future to build from scratch. All of that was real and present and heavy. The date was the one place where none of it was allowed to follow him inside. By keeping the evening light and focused on her, on connection, on pleasure, he was offering something genuinely rare, a few hours where the world outside did not exist. That was not suppression. That was a form of care. And if she picked up a small souvenir at the theater lobby, a program, a trinket, from a shop window they passed, he carried it, without being asked. Her hands remained free for the entire evening, from the moment he helped her with her coat at her front door to the moment he walked her back to it. It sounds small, but it was a continuous, unbroken thread of attentiveness that ran through every hour they spent together. Now we arrive at the part of the evening that was in many ways the most scrutinized of all. How a date ended was remembered as clearly as how it began, sometimes more clearly. The walk back to the car, the drive home, the final few minutes on her front porch. Every one of those moments had its own unwritten law, and a young man who fumbled any of them could undo every gracious thing he had done in the 3 hours before. Her curfew was not a suggestion. It was a contract, and he was the other signatory. If her father said 10 o'clock, 10 o'clock meant she was standing inside that front door, not pulling into the driveway. 1 minute late could end a courtship permanently, not because the girl was angry, but because her father was, and in 1950s courtship, her father's opinion of a young man was not a minor consideration. It was often the deciding one. The curfew was a triangular trust. Her parents set it as a boundary of their household. She honored it as a reflection of her own reputation. And he honored it as proof that he understood the weight of their confidence in him. When he delivered her home on time, he was not just being punctual. He was demonstrating that he could be trusted with something irreplaceable. That was the entire point. Punctuality was character made visible. What we lost when curfews dissolved and parents stopped waiting up is harder to name than it first appears. It was not the restriction that had value. It was the external structure that made a young man's reliability visible and measurable in real time. You could not fake it. Either she was home by 10 or she was not. In a world where so much of character is invisible, that concrete, clock-driven accountability was something rare, something we have not quite replaced. When he walked her home, he did not stop at the curb. He did not stop at the bottom of the porch steps. He walked her all the way to the front door, stood with her while she found her key, and waited until she was safely inside before he turned to leave. This was not optional. A young man who said goodnight from the driveway was considered careless at best, and at worst, the kind of man her mother would quietly warn her about the next morning. Walking her to the door completed a circuit. He had rung that bell at the beginning of the evening, stood in her family's entryway, shaken her father's hand. Now he returned her to that same threshold, intact, on time, cared for. The front door was not just a door. It was the frame around the entire evening, and delivering her back to it was the closing of a promise he had made, implicitly the moment he first knocked. The symmetry was the point. And then there was the question of the good night. On a first date, the answer was almost always the same: a polite handshake, or perhaps a gentle hug if the evening had gone particularly well. A kiss on a first date was considered fast, and that word carried real social weight in 1950s America. It did not mean exciting. It meant a girl who could not be taken seriously, and no young man with genuine intentions wanted to be the reason that word attached itself to someone he admired. The restraint was not about indifference. It was about reputation, and in 1950s America, a young woman's reputation was a genuine social asset that could open or close doors in her community, her church, her workplace. A man who understood that, who held back not because he was uninterested, but because he respected what she stood to lose, was communicating something profound. He was saying that her standing in the world mattered more to him than his own gratification in that moment. What was lost when that restraint disappeared was something the modern world has struggled to name. It was the slow build, the earned progression. The way holding back on a first date made the second date feel charged with possibility, and the third feel like a genuine milestone. Every small step forward meant something because it had been preceded by deliberate patience. Romance had a tempo, and that tempo created anticipation that no amount of speed could replicate. The waiting was not wasted time. It was the architecture of longing. By the late 1960s, the counterculture had begun to dismantle these rituals with remarkable speed. The formal date gave way to casual hanging out. The corsage gave way to showing up unannounced. The Wednesday invitation gave way to a last-minute phone call, then a text, then a swipe on a screen. Each step felt like liberation at the time, and in some ways it was. But something else dissolved alongside the rigidity, the shared language, the code that both people could read, the ceremony that told you, without words, that this mattered. Taken together, these 30 rules were not really about manners. They were a shared language, a vocabulary of gesture and ritual that both people in a courtship could read fluently. When he walked on the street side of the sidewalk, she did not need to ask what it meant. When he stood as she approached the table, she did not need to wonder if she was welcome. The code removed ambiguity from romance, and in doing so, it gave both people something genuinely rare: the feeling of being unambiguously cared for. I want to be honest with you about something. This is not a video that asks you to wish women back into the economic constraints of 1950, where they earned 59 cents for every dollar a man made, where their choices were narrowed by law and expectation in ways that caused real harm. That world had genuine injustices, and I will not smooth them over. But grief and critique can coexist. You can mourn the ceremony without mourning the inequality. You can miss the ritual without missing the cage. What I grieve is not the power structure. It is the intentionality. The sense that romance deserved preparation and care and a specific plan. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Of all 30 rules we walked through tonight, which one moved you most? Was it the Wednesday invitation, the curb walk, the way he stood when she approached the table? Leave it in the comments below, because those answers tell us something true about what we are still quietly hoping for. And if this kind of forgotten romance history speaks to you, subscribe to Clara's Forgotten Romance. I am in these old columns and courtship manuals every week, and there is so much more to uncover together.